The day had arrived. The first group of Zalcor medical students, 24 strong, had landed at the human space station Arcadia 9. The shuttle's smooth descent through the station's atmosphere had sent ripples of excitement throughout the station. The Zalcor were a species that humanity had heard of for decades, but had never directly interacted with. Their technology was legendary, their understanding of the cosmos vast, and their reputation for medical advancements left even the most experienced human doctors in awe. Dr. Sarah Keegan, the lead physician at Arcadia 9, stood at the docking bay as the shuttle doors hissed open, her eyes scanning the alien faces. She had spent most of her career studying human biology and medicine, but this was different. The Zalcor were no ordinary visitors. They were here to learn, but more importantly, they were here to assess the humans' ability to contribute to galactic medical knowledge. The Zalcor were a towering species, their slender frames moving with a grace that suggested they were built for long-distance travel and precision. Their skin was pale, nearly translucent, with faint streaks of silver that shimmered under the light. Their eyes, large and dark, held a depth of knowledge that was unnerving. The aliens had a reputation for perfectionism, both in their technology and in their understanding of life. Yet, there was something about their elegance that felt detached, almost clinical. Zrill, one of the students, was the first to step off the shuttle, a serious look on his face. His black hair was tightly braided, and his long, sharp features were framed by the silver markings on his skin. He scanned the humans, his eyes sharp and observant, his expression unreadable. He was young, no older than 20 by human standards, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen the vast reaches of the universe. Behind him, the rest of the students followed. Dr. Keegan gave them a warm smile, trying to break the tension. "Welcome to Arcadia 9. We're honored to have you here." Zrilla's eyes briefly flicked to her before he spoke, his voice smooth but laced with the cool, measured tone of someone accustomed to authority. "We've heard much about your medical practices. I hope they live up to the claims." The comment hung in the air, and Dr. Keegan's smile faltered for a brief moment. She was used to the unspoken superiority of alien species, but she hadn't expected it so overtly. "I'm sure you'll find our methods unconventional, but effective," she replied, maintaining her professionalism. The Zalcor students were led through the station's grand halls, their steps silent on the polished floors. Dr. Keegan guided them to the medical wing, where she intended to introduce them to the station's facilities. The walk was quiet, but Zrilla's gaze darted from one room to the next, examining the humans' crude but functional equipment with a sense of curiosity that bordered on amusement. As they reached the medical wing, Dr. Keegan led them to a demonstration room where a human volunteer awaited. He was a middle-aged man, slightly overweight, with a bandage wrapped around his arm. He looked at the aliens with interest, but his expression betrayed a hint of nervousness. "Today, we'll demonstrate a few basic procedures," Dr. Keegan began. "These are common injuries we deal with on a daily basis. While you may find our equipment rudimentary, we've found that a combination of hands-on experience and practical knowledge is just as vital as advanced technology." Zrill raised an eyebrow. "I would assume you have medical scanners more advanced than this." Dr. Keegan nodded. "We do, but these are for situations where quick thinking and human ingenuity are necessary. Let me show you." She gestured for the volunteer to sit down on the examination table. The patient extended his arm, and Dr. Keegan began by carefully unwrapping the bandage. The injury was a deep cut, the result of an industrial accident. The Zalcor students crowded around, their eyes glued to the wound, waiting for the human to pull out some high-tech device that would make the injury vanish in seconds. Instead, Dr. Keegan took a small needle and thread from a simple tray and began stitching the wound. The Zalcor watched in silence, their eyes wide with curiosity. It was almost as if they expected the wound to heal itself as soon as the needle made contact. "Simple stitches," Dr. Keegan said as she worked. "This is how we handle injuries that don't require immediate nanotech intervention. Basic and effective." Zrill leaned forward slightly, intrigued but skeptical. "You mean to tell me that this is your preferred method?" Dr. Keegan smiled, pausing for a moment to look at him. It's not a matter of preference, Zrill. It's about adapting to the situation. Not every injury can be fixed with a quick, automated solution. Sometimes, the patient's survival depends on our ability to think quickly and use what we have available. Zrill's gaze hardened slightly, but he said nothing. He watched the doctor finish stitching the wound with practiced precision, and then the volunteer stood, testing his arm. The wound was already starting to close, the edges knitting together with astonishing speed. Impressive, Zrill said, though his tone suggested that the real test would come later. As the demonstration concluded, the students dispersed to the next part of their tour. But Zrill lingered for a moment, his eyes lingering on Dr. Keegan. "Tell me," he asked quietly, "why do you rely on such primitive methods?" Dr. Keegan turned to face him, meeting his gaze. "Because sometimes, Zrill, technology fails. Sometimes, the patient's life depends on how well you can think on your feet. The ability to improvise, to find a solution when nothing seems to work, that's a human skill." Zrill nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing. "I will need to learn more." The day passed with further demonstrations, each one more impressive to the Zalcor students than the last. The humans had their quirks, their strange ways of doing things, but there was something undeniably effective about their approach. They weren't reliant on perfection. They worked with what they had. By the end of the day, Dr. Keegan had earned the respect of most of the students, though Zrill still maintained his skepticism. He didn't understand how these primitive humans could compete with his species' technology. But something inside him was beginning to shift. The idea that humans could heal with nothing more than a needle, thread, and a bit of creativity was slowly cracking the facade of his certainty. As the Zalcor students retired to their quarters that evening, Zrill found himself unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to Dr. Keegan's words, the ability to improvise. He had always been taught that the best solutions came from technology, from the ability to manipulate the body with perfect precision. The human way of doing things was messy, unpredictable, and, he had to admit, fascinating. Maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn from these strange, resilient humans after all. "Word count, 200 words," you said. The next morning, the Zalcor students gathered in the station's gymnasium for a physical training exercise. Despite the high-tech equipment scattered across the room, gymnastic machines, zero-gravity treadmills, and simulators designed to test endurance in various environments, the atmosphere was tense. The students, still adjusting to the human methods they'd witnessed yesterday, were struggling to reconcile their advanced technology with the more primitive approaches they'd been shown. Zrill found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, he knew the superiority of his species' technology could solve nearly any medical issue in an instant. On the other, there was something undeniably human about the way Dr. Keegan handled problems. She didn't wait for the perfect solution. She improvised, adapted, and used the resources at hand. It was a concept that was beginning to gnaw at him. As the students lined up, the human instructors briefed them on their physical conditioning drills. The first exercise was a basic obstacle course, designed to test their agility, coordination, and ability to function under pressure. The Zalcor students were adept at these tasks, their physiology designed for speed and dexterity. However, they were unused to the unpredictable elements the humans loved to incorporate into their training. Zrill was the first to tackle the course. His form was perfect, his movements efficient and calculated. He leaped over hurdles, slid under low-hanging bars, and darted between obstacles with the precision of a seasoned athlete. The other Zalcor students followed, their grace and control impressive. But, as the course progressed, the final challenge, a high jump over a narrow gap, proved difficult for Kashira, one of Zrill's classmates. Kashira miscalculated the distance, her foot catching on the edge of the platform. She fell hard, twisting her arm at an unnatural angle. There was a sickening crack as her arm collided with the floor. She screamed in pain, clutching her forearm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Immediate response, one of the instructors shouted, rushing to her side. The human instructors, though clearly concerned, stepped back to allow the Zalcor to work. Zrill was at Kashira's side almost instantly. His mind raced as he assessed the injury. He had seen broken limbs before, and his species' medical technology was more than capable of fixing them with minimal delay. But as he turned to activate the medical device embedded in his wrist, standard for any Zalcor who sustained an injury, he realized with a sinking feeling that the system wasn't responding. He tried again. Nothing. Panic briefly flickered in his eyes before he forced it down. "The device isn't working," he muttered to the instructor. "We need to stabilize her manually until the repair is complete." The human instructor nodded, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the rising tension among the Zalcor. "We've got it from here," she said, her voice steady. "Zrill, step back." Zrill hesitated, but the instructor's presence commanded respect. He stepped aside, his gaze never leaving Kashira's pained expression. The injury was severe. The bone was clearly fractured, and she was already starting to go into shock. Yet the humans acted quickly, without hesitation, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. Dr. Keegan appeared from the crowd, moving quickly but purposefully. She knelt by Kashira, assessing the injury with swift, practiced motions. "Kashira, I need you to stay calm," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is going to hurt, but it'll be over soon." The Zalcor students watched, fascinated. They had all seen their species' medical devices at work, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were witnessing now. Dr. Keegan moved with a quiet confidence, her hands steady as she splinted the arm, preparing it for transport. She did everything without the aid of a machine, no scans, no nanobots, just her hands and the medical supplies at her side. Zrill felt a pang of frustration deep within him. How could these humans do this so effortlessly? Where was their technology? He had been taught that perfection lay in the use of advanced tools, that human methods were archaic, ineffective, and time-consuming. Yet, in front of him, Dr. Keegan was showing him something far more valuable: resilience. "We're going to need to transport her to the medical wing," Dr. Keegan said, her voice still calm but firm. "Zrill, I need your help." Zrill was caught off guard by the request. His species was accustomed to doing everything themselves, relying on the technology they carried. Yet here he was, being asked to assist in something so simple as moving an injured person. He nodded, swallowing his pride, and followed Dr. Keegan as they carefully moved Kashira to the medical bay. As they walked, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The Zalcor medical device, so advanced and reliable in every situation, had failed. And the humans, whose technology was considered far inferior, had managed to keep Kashira stable, without hesitation and without the need for any high-tech equipment. Once inside the medical wing, Dr. Keegan continued working with precise, focused movements. Zrill watched as she worked quickly to stabilize Kashira's arm, using basic human techniques he had never seen before. Her stitches were clean and swift, and her hand was never uncertain. She didn't rely on technology to give her the answers. She was the answer. Kashira's arm was soon immobilized in a splint, and the pain relief was administered manually, though Zrill noticed that the humans used far less medication than his species would have deemed necessary. Despite the obvious discomfort, Kashira's breathing slowed, and her pulse began to steady. "Is she going to be all right?" Zrill asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and skepticism. Dr. Keegan nodded as she adjusted the splint. "She'll be fine. We'll keep an eye on her overnight, but I've stabilized her injury as best as I can with what I have." Zrill's mind was racing. He had just seen a human doctor do, in a few minutes, what his species' advanced technology might have struggled to do, and without the need for instantaneous perfection. Instead of relying on a perfect solution, Dr. Keegan had relied on experience, knowledge, and calm. And the result had been effective. Zrill couldn't shake the thought that there was something deeply human about all of this. They didn't always have the perfect solution, but they always found a way to adapt and persevere. Later that evening, as the medical wing settled into quiet, Zrill found himself in his quarters, still wrestling with the day's events. He had spoken to his classmates, some of whom shared his skepticism, but he knew that things were changing within him. He could no longer dismiss human ingenuity so easily. Their adaptability, their resilience in the face of unexpected challenges, was something that his people had never truly understood. He hadn't expected to feel this way. But as he lay in his bunk, thinking about Kashira's injury and Dr. Keegan's calm, he realized that there was much more to the human spirit than he had ever given credit for. And perhaps, he thought as he closed his eyes, maybe there was something his people could learn from humanity after all. Word count. 200 words. You said. The days following Kashira's injury passed quickly, and the atmosphere on Arcadia 9 grew tense. The Zalcor students, though still respectful, had begun to voice their skepticism more openly. While they had acknowledged the competence of the human doctors, many were struggling with the idea that humanity's reliance on intuition and creativity could ever truly compete with the precision of Zalcor technology. Zrill, however, was different. Every interaction with Dr. Keegan and her team chipped away at his initial disdain for human methods. There was something about the way they worked, an underlying confidence in their own ability to adapt, that intrigued him. It wasn't just about technology or tools. It was about humanity itself. Their ability to think in the moment, to make decisions in the absence of perfect information, was something Zrill had never encountered before. He knew he had to understand it better, but he wasn't ready to admit it fully, not yet. The challenge came sooner than anyone expected. It was during a training session in one of the simulation rooms, an environment that replicated various alien worlds, that disaster struck. The simulation was designed to test the medical response to environmental hazards, such as toxic atmospheres or gravitational anomalies. The humans had intentionally made the environment unpredictable, incorporating both physical and biological challenges. The students were divided into small groups, each tasked with dealing with different injury scenarios in a simulated extraterrestrial landscape. Zrill was working with a human medical officer named Lieutenant Ryan, a seasoned officer with a reputation for keeping his cool in the worst of situations. His demeanor was calm, his instructions clear. All right, Zrill, your task is to stabilize the patient after exposure to a toxic gas. You'll need to act quickly, but remember, the patient's vitals are delicate, so don't rush, Lieutenant Ryan explained, his voice steady. The patient in question, an android simulation used to mimic human physiology, had been exposed to a dangerous level of gas that impaired its respiratory function. Zrill immediately assessed the situation, his mind calculating the best course of action. He was quick to activate his wrist device, which immediately began scanning the patient's condition. The gas was corrosive. Any treatment would require a delicate approach. Zrill was about to issue a command to initiate the medical drone repair system when, to his shock, the device blinked out. The scanning module malfunctioned. His wrist device, so reliable under normal circumstances, had failed. Zrill's first instinct was to fall back on his training. The procedure to handle such exposure was simple, especially with the advanced tech his people carried. But without his device, he felt his confidence waver. He glanced around, hoping to see the familiar technological systems that would provide him with the data he needed, but the simulation room was intentionally stripped of such luxuries. Looks like we're on our own, Zrill, Lieutenant Ryan said, his voice casual, as though this were no big deal. Take a deep breath. We'll figure it out. Zrill's eyes narrowed in frustration. Figure it out? How was he supposed to figure it out? The human methods he had observed thus far were rudimentary, relying on instinct and improvisation, neither of which could match the precision of Zalcor technology. But Lieutenant Ryan wasn't panicking. He wasn't even mildly stressed. He was calm. Zrill took a step back, trying to regain his focus. He had a patient to save. The pressure in his chest was beginning to build. He could feel the cold edge of uncertainty creeping in. He had been in life-threatening situations before, but never without the crutch of his technology. It was at that moment that Dr. Keegan entered the simulation room. She had been overseeing the other groups, but now she turned her attention to Zrill and Lieutenant Ryan. Her eyes flicked to the malfunctioning device on Zrill's wrist, then to the android patient, now beginning to show signs of significant respiratory failure. I see we have a problem, she said, her tone neutral but sharp. What's the situation? Zrill hesitated, his mind racing. The scanning device has malfunctioned. I cannot diagnose the patient's condition with any precision. Dr. Keegan raised an eyebrow. All right. So, what do we know? Zrill blinked. We know the gas exposure is severe. The respiratory system is failing. But without more information. I didn't ask you for more information, Dr. Keegan interrupted. I asked what we know. You've got the basic symptoms. You know the anatomy of the patient. You know how to stabilize it. Now, what's your plan? Zrill was momentarily stunned by her directness. He opened his mouth to argue, but Lieutenant Ryan spoke up first. Zrill, he said, his tone warm but insistent. Don't overthink it. Just work with what you've got. You've been trained for this. The patient needs you. Zrill took a deep breath, focusing on the android. The patient's skin was beginning to pale, and its breath was shallow, the artificial lungs struggling to keep up. His mind switched into autopilot mode. He could rely on his training. That was the only certainty he had. He moved quickly to the patient, checking the artificial lungs filtration system. The toxins had impaired the airways, and it was obvious that the synthetic organs needed to be flushed. Zrill hesitated, wondering if the procedure would be successful without the usual medical tools. But then he remembered something Dr. Keegan had said during one of their earlier lessons. In medicine, the body is always the first tool. Everything else is secondary. Zrill ripped open the chest cavity, exposing the filtration systems. He moved as quickly as he could, clearing the blockages with his hands. It was rough work, messier than he was accustomed to, but it was effective. As he worked, his thoughts began to shift. The longer he spent in the simulation, the more he began to understand the human perspective. They didn't rely on perfect data or perfect conditions. They relied on their ability to think and act. The android's breath began to steady, the systems inside slowly coming back to life. Zrill felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He was doing it without his technology, without his usual tools.
And it was working.
Finally, he stepped back and wiped his hands on his suit. Lieutenant Ryan was already inspecting the android's vitals, nodding in approval. Well done, he said with a grin. I didn't think you'd pull that off without the tech. Zrill looked over at Dr. Keegan. She was watching him with an inscrutable expression. That was a good save, Zrill, she said. Not perfect, but you adapted. You worked with what you had. That's what makes you a good doctor. Zrill blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected a compliment from Dr. Keegan, especially not after he had struggled so much. But her words sank in. In that moment, Zrill realized something fundamental. Perfection wasn't the point. The ability to survive, to adapt and improvise in the face of adversity, was. Zrill turned to Lieutenant Ryan, who was still smiling. I see now. The human way isn't about perfect answers. It's about finding solutions in the middle of chaos. Lieutenant Ryan nodded.
Exactly.
You've got the basics. Now you just need to trust yourself. Zrill felt a small, but significant shift in his understanding. The Zalcor had always prided themselves on their ability to achieve perfection. But perfection, he realized, often left no room for improvisation, for growth. As the simulation ended and the students began to file out of the room, Zrill lingered for a moment, his mind whirring with new thoughts. He had just taken his first steps toward understanding what it meant to be human. And for the first time since arriving at Arcadia 9, he felt a strange sense of respect for the species that had, in a few short days, managed to break down the walls of a certainty. Word count: 200 words. The final day of the training simulation arrived faster than anyone expected. The Zalcor students had spent the last few weeks acclimating to the human methods of medicine, fieldwork, and survival tactics. It hadn't been easy, especially for Zrill, who had struggled to reconcile the simplicity of the human approach with the advanced precision of Zalcor technology. However, as the days passed, something shifted inside him, a sense of respect, even admiration for the way humanity operated. Their ingenuity, their ability to think on their feet, was both humbling and awe-inspiring. Now, the stakes were higher than ever. The final test was designed to challenge the students' ability to adapt under pressure. They would be sent into a simulated crisis scenario where they would have to work with human teams to resolve a life-threatening emergency. The simulation was complex, combining both medical and tactical elements, and it would push them to their limits. Zrill stood in the briefing room, his arms crossed, as Dr. Keegan addressed the group of Zalcor students and their human counterparts. You'll be split into mixed teams for this final challenge, she explained. Each team will face a different type of emergency: an explosion, a biological outbreak, or an environmental collapse. The goal is not to rely on technology or predefined solutions, but to think critically, adapt, and save lives with what's available to you. Zrill felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been mentally preparing for this, but the pressure was still mounting. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This time, he wasn't relying on his perfect technology. This time, he would have to think like a human. Dr. Keegan's voice broke through his thoughts. You'll have 1 hour to resolve the situation. Work together, think creatively, and remember, it's not about perfection. It's about survival. With that, the briefing ended, and the students were led into the simulation rooms. Zrill found himself paired with Lieutenant Ryan, a human officer he had come to respect during their time together. Ryan gave him a reassuring nod as they entered their designated scenario, a biological outbreak on a remote research station. The simulation was immersive, with the room transforming into a detailed replica of a small research station on an isolated planet. The air was thick with the smell of sterilizers and decay, and the hum of a failing environmental system buzzed in the background. Several patients were scattered around the room, some unconscious, others writhing in pain, their bodies slowly succumbing to an alien virus that had infected the station's atmosphere. Zrill immediately took stock of the situation. The humans had already begun to implement quarantine protocols, sealing off the infected zones and isolating the uninfected individuals. Lieutenant Ryan was at the center of the chaos, barking orders and coordinating with his team. Zrill took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the chaos ahead. Zrill, we need to prioritize treatment, Lieutenant Ryan said, his voice calm and clear despite the escalating tension. There are limited resources, so we'll need to make some tough calls. Zrill nodded, scanning the room for any immediate dangers. He noticed several biohazard containers filled with contaminated equipment. In one corner, a group of humans was struggling to stabilize an unconscious patient, their medical devices flashing red, indicating imminent organ failure. We'll need to administer a temporary antidote to slow the virus, Zrill said, his mind racing. The infection is spreading too fast to wait for a full cure. Lieutenant Ryan gave him a look of cautious agreement. But we don't have a full antidote. We'll have to work with what we've got. Zrill's eyes narrowed as he analyzed the situation. He was accustomed to dealing with precise, data-driven solutions, but here, in this chaotic environment, there was no perfect answer. He had to think on his feet. He spotted a small set of human medical tools, basic but effective, on a nearby counter. Among them was a standard syringe, a vial of medicine, and several makeshift devices that could be used to stabilize a patient. The realization hit him like a jolt. He could apply his own knowledge of biology, but the real challenge would be in how he adapted the human tools to the situation. He didn't have the high-tech instruments he was used to, but these human methods were designed for adaptability. Ryan, Zrill called, his voice steady. We need to set up a series of makeshift respirators. The virus attacks the respiratory system first. If we stabilize their breathing, we can buy time for a cure. Ryan was already moving, issuing commands to the rest of the team. Zrill worked quickly, preparing the syringe with a temporary antidote and administering it to the most critical patient. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would slow the virus just long enough for them to start stabilizing the other patients. The team moved quickly, Zrill and Ryan coordinating the treatment with the others. As they worked, Zrill's mind flashed back to his previous experiences with the Zalcor. Everything had always been about precision and the fastest, most efficient method. But here, in this simulation, there was no room for perfection. It was all about improvisation, thinking on his feet, and adjusting to the constantly changing situation. For the first time since arriving on Arcadia 9, Zrill began to feel a sense of connection with the humans around him. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were incredibly resourceful. They used whatever they had at hand, even when the odds were stacked against them. Zrill had seen that over and over again, From Dr. Keegan's work in the medical bay to Lieutenant Ryan's calm decision-making under pressure. It was human ingenuity in its purest form. Finally, after what felt like hours, the team managed to stabilize the majority of the patients. The antidote was beginning to take effect, and the infected individuals were slowly regaining consciousness. The outbreak was under control. Zrill wiped sweat from his brow, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. They had done it. Lieutenant Ryan clapped him on the back. Nice work, Zrill. You adapted well to the situation. Zrill nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. It wasn't perfect, he said, his voice thoughtful. But we survived. And that's all that matters. Dr. Keegan's voice came over the comms, signaling the end of the simulation. Well done, everyone. The scenario is complete. You all did better than expected. As the simulation room began to return to its original state, Zrill felt a sense of pride swell within him. He had faced a challenge unlike any he had ever encountered, and he had emerged stronger for it. He hadn't relied on technology, or perfection, or predetermined solutions. He had relied on his ability to think, to adapt, to improvise. And, most importantly, he had relied on his team. Zrill turned to Lieutenant Ryan, who was already exchanging congratulations with the other students. For the first time since arriving on Arcadia 9, Zrill understood the true value of what he had witnessed in humanity. It wasn't about perfect answers or flawless execution. It was about resilience. It was about the willingness to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against you. In that moment, Zrill realized that the human spirit, so often underestimated by his own species, was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Word count: 1, 200 words.